All right, so first I want to remind you that the lab quiz on the digestive system, or the anatomy of the digestive system, is currently open, and it will close on Friday at midnight. Also, your take-home exam will close on Friday at midnight, so keep that in mind. Let's now cover let me introduce rather this week's module. Okay, and let's see if I can, all right, make this big. Okay, so this week's module is covering your last organ system, which is the urinary system. The urinary system is chapter 15. As always, watch all of the videos. There's about 1 hour and 36 minutes of them. Do your self-test, and that should be completed by the time we start class on the 14th. Also, I will be sending you some materials by email. Print those out and bring them with you to our last face-to-face meeting next week. As always, complete the Muddiest Points wiki, because that helps me figure out what we need to focus on when we have our face-to-face classes. Today we're going to discuss the respiratory system, and as always, a quiz will open at the end of class, and that quiz will close on Sunday at midnight. For lab, this week is your last lab, and it's covering the respiratory system, which is appropriate since we are covering the respiratory system in lecture. To prepare for your practical, complete the practice practical. It's in its regular location, practice practical number 3. Learn the material and master the material using those Quizlets. I use many of the same images that are on the Quizlet will be on the practical. The best way to prepare for the practical is by using those Quizlets. Let me say a couple of things also about the last quiz that you completed. Some of the things that I noticed was that students didn't pay good attention to the questions. For example, I was asking for chordae tendineae in one of the questions, and I pointed to the chordae tendineae of both the mitral and the tricuspid valve. And I said in the question, name the chords, or name the strings, I think. And a good number of students gave me the names of the valves. If I wanted the valves, I would have said name the structures. I would not have said name the chords. And obviously students just looked at where the and what was interesting is I pointed to the chordae tendineae of both valves. The reason why I didn't pick one valve is because I was afraid students wouldn't know, was I asking for the chords or was I asking for the valves? So I pointed to both valves, so it wasn't the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve, right? And then I asked for the chords in the question, and I still got students answer valves because they didn't read the question. Make sure you read the questions. Also, for those blood vessels where you have to indicate right and left, please do so. For the coronary artery, you have to indicate if it's the right or the left coronary artery. And I had students that just said coronary artery. Also, I have students do not include the term artery or vein. You must at least include A for artery and V for vein. You cannot just provide the name of the blood vessel. You have to include whether it is an artery or vein. At least include an A or a V. And lastly, there was one other thing. Yeah, some students they didn't include the full the full names for some of the structures. Like, it is the interventricular septum. I had students just say septum. Refer to your study guides. I list on your study guides everything you have to know. Septum was not listed on your study guide. Interventricular septum was listed on your study guide. On the Quizlets, you won't find the word septum. You will find interventricular septums. Use the words that I provide you. Okay? If it's 2 words, then learn the 2 words, right? Don't try to shorten it and what have you. Okay? Your practical will be just like the previous practical. There'll be 50 questions. You'll have 42 minutes. They will cover all of the labs we've had since the last practical. So heart, blood vessels, digestive system, respiratory system. In general, students find this last practical the easiest, I believe, or at least I find students perform the best. I think some of it is it's just not a very difficult lab. They don't cover the most difficult labs. And also by this time, I think students have sort of figured out how to study for lab. Okay? I'll talk more about this next week when I introduce the module preparing for your final exam. But just to at least get it on your schedule, your final exam will open on Wednesday, May 20th at 8 a.m. So I'm opening it a day earlier than I typically have been opening your exams. And it will close on Friday, May 22nd. So that's 2 weeks from yesterday. There will be 2 parts of the exam. The first part will cover all of the new chapters that we're covering: digestive, respiratory, urinary, and then there'll be a second portion that will cover, there will be 50 questions, and they'll cover all the previous chapters, and there'll be 50 relatively short multiple choice questions. Okay. All right, so what I want to do now is just see if there are any questions before we start going over the content that was covered on this week's module of respiratory system. Any questions about that information that I just went over? Okay, so there's I do want a little more interaction between you and I today than I've experienced the last couple of weeks. I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm going to want students to respond, either responding verbally or orally, or you can type in a response. But please, 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 when we get to especially some of the, I'm going to ask you to do some activities using your body as a living model to learn. Please participate and join in and respond and answer some of the questions that I'm going to throw out at you. All right. So I really, really need participation for you to get the most out of this face-to-face experience that we're having today. And you've come here, you're taking time to be here, and you could have been anywhere else, and you chose to be here today. So I want to make sure that you get the most value out of spending time with me and your peers today. Okay, so let's go into today's content. I hope I'm doing this right. Okay, see if this pops up. Alrighty, so this week we covered the respiratory system, and using your muddiest points results from the wiki, I'm going to cover specific topics. And okay, so from the first screencast, Introduction to Organization of the Respiratory System, we had a couple of questions about the 5 processes that are involved in respiration. And this is an appropriate place to start because it basically outlines what most of the chapter on the respiratory system is about. And it's the 5 processes of respiration. So what I'm going to do now is sort of outline those processes, and then we're going to go into some detail in some of those processes in a moment. All right, so first let's start with the function of the respiratory system. Why do we care about the respiratory system? What does it do that makes it so important? Well, if you remember from chapter 1, when we covered the survival needs of the body, those are conditions or resources that the body has to have in order to maintain life, right? In order for it to accomplish life functions. It has these survival needs, and one of those survival needs is oxygen. You of course know oxygen is needed by the body at all times, and that carbon dioxide is produced by the body at all times and has to be removed. And that is the function of the respiratory system along with the cardiovascular system. The respiratory system oxygenates the blood. It brings oxygen from the air in the outside environment and loads it into our blood. And it removes carbon dioxide that our body is constantly producing, right? Removes it from the blood or unloads it from the blood and then places it in the outside air. So that's the function of the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system oxygenates the blood and removes the carbon dioxide. Then the cardiovascular system then has to transport the oxygenated blood from the lungs to the tissues and the deoxygenated blood, which is high in carbon dioxide, to the lungs. So the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system work together to provide oxygen to all the tissues of the body and to remove carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, respiration is the production of energy. That's what respiration is, and it happens at the cellular level. Each of your cells uses oxygen to oxidize, literally burn, if you will, organic compounds like glucose and fatty acids to produce ATP, right? Because that's the source of energy used by the cells, the energy currency of the cells. And so that's why our cells need oxygen at all times. If we don't have oxygen, they can't produce the ATP that they need, and they will die. At the same time, they produce carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide, if it builds up, can drop the pH of blood and tissues and cause toxic effects. All right, so the cells of the body need oxygen, and they need organic compounds that oxygen will then oxidize. Cells use oxygen, specifically the mitochondria use oxygens to make ATP, and the byproducts of that oxidation are carbon dioxide and water. So that's what respiration is. Okay, and specifically this is cellular respiration. When we talk about respiration at the organismal level, that is at the level of the human body, that includes all the processes that are necessary in getting that oxygen to the cells and then getting that carbon dioxide removed from the body. So it's pulmonary ventilation, it is gas exchange, loading the oxygen into the blood. It's transporting that oxygenated blood to the cells. It's transporting the deoxygenated blood away from the cells, and and then while the oxygenated blood is at the systemic capillaries, it's gas exchange there. So respiration includes all the processes that are necessary to get oxygen to cells and remove the carbon dioxide from the cells. So let's look at that now. The 4 events of respiration. Well, your book includes 4 events of respiration. My slides, because I made them from another book, contain 5 events of respiration. I'll explain the discrepancy there. So this is the image. This is a slide from the screencast. on introduction and organization of the respiratory system. It basically outlines the 5 events of respiration. So that those are all of the events necessary to bring oxygen to the cells and remove carbon dioxide from the cells. The first is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is simply breathing. Okay, so pulmonary ventilation is breathing, bringing air into the lungs. Well, after the air is in the lungs, what's the next step? The next step is what's called external gas exchange. It is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the air in the lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. Here is where the blood is loaded with oxygen and carbon dioxide is unloaded from the blood to the air in the lungs. After that after that blood is oxygenated, it's then transported to cells. So the left ventricle contracts and then disperses that oxygenated blood to all of the tissues of the body. And we call that gas transport. And that's completed by the cardiovascular system. That oxygenated blood is then taken to all of the tissues of the body, and there is where we have internal gas exchange. Internal gas exchange, oxygen is unloaded from the blood of the systemic capillaries to the tissues, and then carbon dioxide, which is produced by the tissues, is loaded into the blood. And then gas transport works again, where that deoxygenated blood is transported to the right atrium of the heart via the inferior and superior vena cava. Now, those are the only 4 events of respiration that are covered in your book. In your slides, I also included cellular respiration, even though we don't go over it, and I won't ask any questions about it. But the book that I previously used talked about cellular respiration. And of course, that's where the ATP is produced from the use of oxygen to oxidize glucose and other substances. We talked a little bit about that in the muscular system. So those are the 5 events of respiration. Those are all of the events that are required in order for cells to produce ATP. Only the first 4 are of interest to us in the respiratory system, because all of those involve the respiratory system. Okay, let's go over each of those events in a little more detail. The first is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is simply breathing, right? It's just moving air in and out of your lungs, okay? So I am going to ask this question. I want you to tell me what you think. Now, there is no right or wrong answer, okay? I want you to simply tell me, why do you think we breathe? Yes, it's because your cells need oxygen. That is correct. But what part of this process of getting oxygen to your cells does breathing serve? Give me some thoughts. You can unmute your microphone and tell me what you think, or you can simply chat into your thoughts in the chat. If you do want to respond orally, if you could raise your hand so I can recognize you, so that we don't have too many people speaking at once, that I would appreciate. So why do we breathe? What are your thoughts? Come now, someone must have some thoughts on why we breathe. Why do we bring air in and out of our lungs? What are we trying to maintain? Let me give you a hint. I think I have that on here. I want you to think about gradients, right? A gradient is a difference between 2 locations. So thinking about gradients, why do we breathe? Okay, Taylor, very good. So the question I have for you is, what you state is correct. How does breathing help get rid of carbon dioxide? Someone want to add to what Taylor is saying? Anyone? There are 10 of you out there. Just tell me what you think. Okay, it has everything to do about maintaining gradients. Any ideas what gradients are being maintained? Correct, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, let's go ahead and thank you so much for responding. All right, so the reason why we breathe is we're trying to constantly refresh the air in our lungs. Well, why is that important? If you stop breathing, the carbon dioxide levels in your lungs will increase and the oxygen levels in your lungs will decrease. And that will decrease the gradients of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air in your lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries, which brings us to our next event of respiration, which is external respiration. So in our lungs, you have these alveoli, these air sacs, right? And along the outer surface of those air sacs, there are pulmonary capillaries. And it's across the walls of pulmonary capillaries and the walls of these air sacs that gas exchange occurs. Carbon dioxide diffuses out and out of the pulmonary capillaries, and oxygen diffuses in. Now notice I said diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of a substance from high concentration, or in this case, high pressure, to low concentration or low partial pressure. What drives diffusion is a gradient. Just like the steeper a hill, the faster your bike or your skateboard or anything that has wheels will move down that hill. Diffusion relies on gradient. The greater the gradient, the greater diffusion. The reason why we must breathe is in order to maintain these gradients. The bigger the gradient between the air in the alveoli, the carbon dioxide in the alveoli and the carbon dioxide in the pulmonary capillaries, the greater carbon dioxide will diffuse out. The greater the partial pressure gradient of oxygen in the alveoli and the oxygen in the blood, the greater the diffusion of oxygen into blood. And so, in order to maintain these gradients, we have to breathe. Okay, so breathing is all about maintaining these gradients because these gradients are what drives diffusion. Okay, if I wanted to increase the carbon dioxide levels in my blood, what could I do, like right here and now? Well, I can hold my breath, right? If I hold my breath, carbon dioxide levels are going to build up in the alveoli. There's going to be less of a gradient there, and that's going to cause less diffusion of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide levels are going to increase in the blood of the pulmonary capillaries. Likewise, what if I wanted to, on the flip side, if I wanted to drive down the carbon dioxide levels in my blood, what would I do? Hyperventilate. If I do that, then I'm going to drive down the carbon dioxide levels in my alveoli. That's going to create a bigger gradient between the carbon dioxide levels in the alveoli and the carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and so more carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out. So breathing is all about maintaining gradients because that's what drives gas exchange, external gas exchange between the blood in the pulmonary capillaries and the air of the alveoli. All right, so after we've oxygenated that blood, we then have to transport it to the cells. And so that blood is transported to the left atrium via the pulmonary veins, down into the left ventricles, and then through the aorta and out to all of the systemic capillaries of the body. It is the cardiovascular system that performs gas transport. When the blood reaches the systemic capillaries, those are the capillaries everywhere else other than the lungs, all right? That is where internal respiration or internal gas exchange occurs. It's considered internal because the exchange is between blood that's inside the body and tissues which are inside the body, right? Here, oxygen is going to be unloaded to the tissues. Carbon dioxide is going to be loaded to the tissues. And again, this process occurs via diffusion. What drives this process is a gradient between the blood in the capillaries and the tissues. Alrighty, so those are the events of respiration. Mike and Laura, you indicated that to be your muddiest points. Just want to make sure that that is clear at this time. So I'm going to take a moment to see if there are any questions. All right, well, we'll move on to the respiratory zone. Looks like Mike and Laura aren't even with us anyway. But it's all good because everybody who's here profits by going over that information. Okay, so we're going to move to the respiratory zone. There were some questions about the respiratory bronchioles. I do want to ask, so this was asked by Kaylin, Mike, Brandon, Scott, and Megan. And let's see if you are in the house today, because I did have some questions. Oh, yeah, Megan is with us, and Scott's not with us. Brandon is not with us. Mike is not with us. But Kaylin is with us. Kaylin and Megan are both with us. So just some, I wonder if you could provide me a little clarity on exactly what was confusing, or if you could just provide some details to help guide me as I try to clarify. Welcome to just chat, or you can unmute your mic and ask the specific question. Okay. Should I go beyond the bronchioles and talk more about not just the respiratory bronchioles, but the alveolar ducts, sacs, that sort of thing? All right, that's what I'll do then. And what I'll do, I'll just check in with you afterward just to make sure that I have answered your question. And let's see, I need to go back to sharing my screen here. Okay, I think this is right. Yeah, okay, this is right. All right, so so this screencast referred to the respiratory zone, which is the portion of the respiratory system where gas exchange actually occurs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by contrasting the respiratory zone with the conducting zone, and then we'll cover the specific portions of the respiratory zone, including the respiratory bronchioles. And I think I'll feel confident that at that point I would have addressed your question about respiratory bronchioles. And of course, if you have additional questions or need clarification, you can certainly ask me at that time. Okay, so so this is showing you the respiratory tree, and the respiratory tree is basically composed of, from your larynx down to the bronchioles. mouse, if you look, basically what happens is you start with a large trachea, and then that trachea subdivides into bronchi and smaller bronchi, and then those bronchi into secondary and tertiary bronchi, and they pretty much branch out like a upside down tree. And so that's why it's referred to in general as a respiratory tree. Now, what you're not looking at here is most of the upper respiratory system. So you're not seeing the nasal cavity or the pharynx or the, well, basically the nasal cavity or the pharynx. But just remember that they are up here. Okay? There is no gas exchange that occurs in the nasal cavity or the pharynx or the larynx or the trachea or even any of the bronchi, the primary, secondary, or tertiary bronchi. They are part of what's called the conducting zone. Now, they play a very important role because they're conducting air to and from the lungs. They're also warming that air and filtering that air and humidifying that air as it makes its journey to the lungs. But there's no gas exchange actually occurring between the air and the blood of the pulmonary capillaries. That doesn't occur until we reach the bronchioles. Bronchi are big, mainly composed of cartilage. Bronchioles are small, microscopic, and they're mainly composed of smooth muscle. Okay, so this is just another view of the respiratory passages, right? So here's the trachea, primary bronchus, secondary bronchus. We've got tertiary bronchi. That's plural, branching off here. Eventually, the bronchi lead to the bronchioles, and you have what's called a terminal bronchiole, and then a terminal bronchiole leads to a respiratory bronchiole, which extends into the alveoli. When we get to the respiratory bronchioles, that is the beginning of what's called the respiratory zone. That's where we actually have gas exchange occurring because we have alveoli. So I'm going to go to this next image here, and so just to sort of ground you, right here is the terminal bronchiole. So this is the last component of the conducting zone. Off of the terminal bronchioles, we have our respiratory bronchioles. The respiratory bronchioles are part of the respiratory zone because they actually have alveoli that are attached to them. In fact, these respiratory bronchioles they sort of dead end into this alveolar sac. I like to think of an alveolar sac as like a bunch of grapes, but instead of having grapes that are filled with grape guts, I don't know any other way to describe what's inside of a grape. Instead, you have like little sacs. This is a frontal cutaway of that. So here's our alveolar duct, which is just an extension of the respiratory bronchiole, and then you have these alveoli connected to it, right? And it's in these alveoli the gas exchange occurs. All along the outside of these alveoli, although not shown here, are the pulmonary capillaries, and gas exchange occurs across the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, so I hope this answered the question about the respiratory bronchiole. Here it is. It's the first portion of the respiratory zone. Okay, let's look a little closer at these alveoli. Did not have this included in my intended presentation, so I'm going to jump to a little further. All right, so here's our alveolus, and again, I said that although not shown here, all along the outer surface is our pulmonary capillaries. And so if you were to magnify the wall of the alveolus here and the pulmonary capillaries that are lying on the outer surface, it would look something like this. This is a cutaway of the on the alveolar sac. Here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, and then on the outer surface of the alveoli are capillaries. And where the two meet, the wall of the capillary and the wall of the alveolus, that's called the respiratory membrane. If we were to magnify that, it looks like this. Here's our alveolus, where we have air. Here's our pulmonary capillary containing blood. The wall of the capillary is composed of simple squamous epithelial cells. The wall of the alveolus, or alveoli, plural, is composed of simple squamous epithelial cells. So we have this really, really thin membrane. It's across that membrane that oxygen and carbon dioxide, where external gas exchange occurs. Okay? Has to be very thin in order for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse across it. If it was very thick, that would be a barrier to gas exchange. Okay? And you saw under the microscope in the tissues lab, you actually observed this. You looked at simple squamous epithelial tissue, if you remember, and you were looking at the respiratory membrane. Okay, so I want to take a moment to pause and make sure that I answered the questions. Oh, so I was just going on and talking and nobody could see that. Is that what you're telling me? Ugh. Okay, so I was not sharing my screen that whole time. So how much of that were you not able to see? If someone could just like unmute your mic and tell me, or none. Okay, well, that's just great. All righty, let me go back. I do apologize. I thought I was sharing my screen. Evidently, I was not. Okay. Now I'm sharing my screen. My apologies. Okay, so okay, all right. Now I know I'm sharing my screen because I'm actually looking at my other screen. All right, so this is the respiratory tree. This is the respiratory tree. Basically, it shows, starting here at the larynx, the trachea. The trachea then subdivides into a primary bronchi, then the primary bronchi into secondary bronchi, and the tertiary bronchi, eventually leading to the bronchioles. First the terminal bronchioles, then the respiratory bronchioles. It's referred to as a respiratory tree because it basically looks, you got smaller and smaller branches, and it looks like an upside down tree. Okay? What's not shown here would be the nasal cavity and the pharynx. Now, we subdivide the respiratory system into the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The conducting zone has an important role of moving air to and from the lungs, but there's no gas exchange occurring there. There's no gas exchange between the air in the conducting zone and the blood of the pulmonary capillaries, right? So the air in your nasal cavity or in your pharynx or in your larynx or your trachea or any of these bronchi, is it participating in gas exchange? No. It's simply being moved to or from the lungs. Now, the conducting zone also helps humidify the air on its way to the lungs and also to filter it. That's very important. And to warm it and humidify it. Right? So the conducting zone plays a very important role. However, gas exchange is not one of them, right? It's simply conducting that air to and from the lungs. Now, once you get down to the level of the respiratory bronchioles, right, then that is the beginning of the respiratory zone, right? So here's our trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, that leads to the terminal bronchioles, and then eventually to the respiratory bronchioles, right? So let's go to this image here. And this image is from your book. So here's the terminal bronchiole leading to the respiratory bronchioles. Now, the respiratory bronchioles are the beginning of the respiratory zone. In the respiratory zone, you actually have gas exchange between the air in the respiratory bronchioles and the blood of the pulmonary capillaries, right? Notice that these respiratory bronchioles lead into the alveolar sacs. And in fact, if we were to blow up an alveolar sac here, you would notice that the alveolar duct is basically where the respiratory bronchioles dead end. These alveoli is where gas exchange actually occurs. Think of these alveoli as like little balloons, so to speak. Gas exchange occurs across the walls of these little balloons, and although not shown here, lying on the outer surface of these little balloons are the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, now I'm gonna move down to another image. So we can see those pulmonary capillaries along with the okay, excuse me just a second. I want to make sure I get the right, I don't know which one would it be. Okay, yeah, this is it. All right, so here we are at the alveolus here. Now, lying on the outer surface of the alveolus are the pulmonary capillaries. It's not shown on this image, but they are there. This image from your book shows what things would look like if we did a frontal section of that alveolar sac. So each of these is an alveolus. On the outer surface, you have your capillaries. Where the two meet, you have the wall of the capillary and the wall of the alveolus, and that's what makes up the respiratory membrane. And that's what you're seeing here in this blow up to the right. Here we have the capillary. You can see the red blood cell in it. Here we have the alveolus with air in it. The wall of the alveolus is composed of a layer of simple squamous epithelial cells. The wall of the capillary is also composed of simple squamous epithelial cells. They share a common basement membrane, and it is across this very thin membrane that oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuses. This is where gas exchange occurs. Okay, gas exchange occurs across the wall of the alveolus and the wall of the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, gas exchange only occurs across the wall of the pulmonary capillaries and the alveolus. Therefore, the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar sacs are part of the respiratory zone. Okay, now that you have actually been able to see the images as I have been explaining them or narrating them, is this more clear? Do you have a better understanding of what the respiratory bronchioles are, functionally how they're different from, say, the terminal bronchioles or any part of the conducting zone? And are there any questions about that? All right, I apologize that I wasn't sharing my screen. Okay, let's move on to pulmonary ventilation. So we had a couple of questions about functional volume and alveolar ventilation rate. And that's where I'm going to focus my time here. So pulmonary ventilation is simply the act of breathing. Okay. No one indicated that any of these other items were muddiest points, so I'm not going to spend any time going over them, but I am going to talk about calculating, define and calculate functional volume and alveolar ventilation rate. So let's look at that. Okay, so right now, as you're sitting, I assume you're sitting, and you're breathing. And every time you breathe in and out, there's a certain amount of air that enters and leaves your respiratory tract. And that's called the tidal volume. It's named after like the tides. You know how tides come in and they go out, right? So it's just called the tidal volume. It's just the amount of air that enters and exits your respiratory tract every time you breathe. Now, a certain percentage of that air never reaches your lungs. Some of it stays in your nasal cavity, your pharynx, your larynx, your trachea, your bronchi. So it doesn't participate in gas exchange. And so it's referred to as the dead space volume because it's not participating in gas exchange, right? So again, all of the air that is anywhere above that red line is part of the dead space volume. Okay? The functional volume is the amount of air that actually enters the respiratory zone. So when you inhale, the air that makes it to your respiratory bronchioles and your alveoli, that is your functional volume. So to calculate your functional volume, we take your tidal volume, we subtract the dead space volume, and we get the functional volume. All right? So let's say your tidal volume is 500 milliliters and dead space volume is 150. That'll give you a functional volume of 350 milliliters. Did I do that right? Is that right? 500 minus 150, or did I calculate that wrong? Yeah, 350. All right, cool. All right, always make careless errors when I was in math. I'd do everything twice. Okay, so 350 milliliters of the 500 milliliters that this person took in would actually reach the alveoli and participate in gas exchange. So how could you, if you needed more air to participate in gas exchange, what could you do to get more air to increase your functional volume? Well, your dead space volume is pretty much constant, right? Your nasal cavity doesn't get any larger when you breathe more deeply, nor does your trachea, nor do your bronchi, because they're basically composed of cartilage, and cartilage doesn't expand very much. So we can increase the functional volume, that is the air that is actually involved in gas exchange, by simply taking deeper breaths. So if one took, say, a deeper breath, slightly deeper breath, and inhaled 600 milliliters of air, the dead space volume would be the same. And if we do the math, the functional volume would be 100 milliliters greater. Because, again, dead space volume is pretty much the same. So if you need more air for gas exchange, you just simply take deeper breaths, right? That's how that works, okay? Easy peasy, makes perfectly good sense, right? All right, so we know how we can increase our functional volume, the amount of air that makes it to our respiratory zone and can participate in gas exchange with every breath. However, what really is going to determine the amount of air that's available for gas exchange is how much air makes it to the respiratory zone over time, right? So if we can get our functional volume, that allows us to also calculate our alveolar ventilation rate, all right? And what that is it's the amount of air that enters the lungs and inflates the alveoli each minute. So what we now have to include is, well, how many breaths do we take a minute? It's all well and good to increase the depth of your breathing, right? But what's really going to determine how much air gets to your respiratory zone that participates in gas exchange is also taking into consideration your respiration rate. All right. Alveolar ventilation rate is your functional volume times your respiration rate. So after we calculate our functional volume, we then also want to multiply that by our respiration rate, and that's going to tell us how much air gets to our how much air gets to our respiratory zone per minute. All right. So if we go back to those two examples that we just had, right? Tidal volume, dead space volume, and then here are our functional volumes. And I believe when we said, well, then let's assume the person is making 15 breaths. I'm sorry, this first person is 12 breaths a minute. So we multiply 12 breaths a minute times 350 milliliters, we get 4,200 milliliters per minute. And for this other person, if we use that same 12 breaths per minute multiplied by the the functional volume, we get 5,400 milliliters per minute. So what this also shows is you can greatly increase the amount of air that gets to that participates in gas exchange by, one, breathing more deeply, because that increases your functional volume, and then breathing more often. Right? Both will enhance how much air participates in gas exchange, right, on their own. You can breathe more often, you can breathe more deeply. If you do both, you greatly increase the amount of air that gets to your respiratory zone. Okay, so let's do one on our own. Let's do one together, right? So let's calculate the alveolar ventilation rate if tidal volume is 550 milliliters and dead space volume is 150 milliliters, and the subject takes 13 breaths a minute. Okay, so I'm gonna let's take a couple of minutes and you can figure that out. What's the person's alveolar ventilation rate? Okay, have you had enough time or do you need a couple of more minutes? Okay, so tidal volume is 550 milliliters, dead space volume is 150, so we take 550 minus 150 and we get 400 milliliters for the functional volume. Then we take that and we multiply it by that 13 breaths a minute. We get a alveolar ventilation rate of 5,200 milliliters per minute. Okay. Everybody get that? Anybody have any problems calculating that? All righty. Okay, we have two more topics to cover, and then we'll be done for the day. And these last two topics, by far, had the greatest number of muddiest points. And I would say this is quite typical. What gas exchange and transport focuses on is how is oxygen and carbon dioxide transported in the blood. And that's really what the focus is here. Okay, how is oxygen and carbon dioxide transported in the blood? Where are carbon dioxide and oxygen transported in the blood? So let's talk about that now. All righty. Oh, stop it. Okay, so gas exchange is made according to the laws of diffusion. So as I mentioned earlier, the larger the gradient the greater the gas exchange you have. So, again, what breathing does is it maintains that appropriate gradient across the respiratory membrane, so that ensuring that sufficient oxygen diffuses into the blood and sufficient carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood, right? And that also is important for establishing the appropriate gradient at the systemic capillaries as well, because there we want oxygen moving out of the blood into the tissues, and carbon dioxide moving the opposite way. All right, so this little figure here shows what's happening in internal respiration and what's happening in external respiration, but whether we're talking about internal gas exchange or external gas exchange, or internal respiration or external respiration, we are talking about diffusion, and what's driving that diffusion is the gradients. All right, so as you know, in the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out, oxygen is going to diffuse in. Both are moving down there, what's called partial pressure gradients, moving from high pressure to low pressure, high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So deoxygenated blood enters the lungs through the pulmonary capillaries, and oxygenated blood leaves the lungs through the pulmonary capillaries. Okay, we already talked about how this gradient is maintained by breathing, so I'm not going to labor that point. What I want to talk about is specifically, okay, we know that oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out, but what about, like, where is it transported? Let's look at external respiration. So we are in the pulmonary capillaries, right? You can see the alveolar sacs here, and here we have the blood of the pulmonary capillary. Let's focus on oxygen. So oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli across the respiratory membrane and into the capillary. First, it enters the plasma, then it enters the red blood cells. And most of the oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin, which I have shown here in abbreviated HB. This is a figure in your book. And so oxygen binds to hemoglobin and forms what's called oxyhemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a protein. It has a little component that's composed of ions called its heme group. When oxygen binds the heme group of hemoglobin, it forms iron oxide, which is also known as rust. And rust is what color? Red. So when oxygen binds hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin, it emits a red color, and that is why blood is red. And that's particularly why blood that is high in oxygen is bright red. So that is where most of the oxygen in the blood is found. It's found bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. In fact, one red blood cell carries roughly 1 billion molecules of oxygen. Now, is there some oxygen dissolved in the plasma? Yes, but it is minor compared to the amount of oxygen that's in the red blood cells. And that's why I have put a little box around the O2 here. This just shows that, yes, it's there, but it's a minor component. Most of the oxygen, overwhelmingly most of the oxygen, is in the red blood cell bound to hemoglobin. Okay? What about carbon dioxide? Where is it? Well, carbon dioxide, when it enters the blood, it interacts with water to form carbonic acid. You know carbonic acid is simply carbonated water, right? When you bubble carbon dioxide through air, right, you get carbonic acid, soda pop. Carbonic acid then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. And so most carbon dioxide in blood is found in the plasma in the form of bicarbonate. Now, a small amount of carbon dioxide does bind to hemoglobin in the red blood cells. But again, it's a small amount, and I've tried to indicate that it's a minor component with the box around HB. Also, I want you to note that carbon dioxide binds hemoglobin at a completely different location than oxygen. So it's not competing with oxygen for hemoglobin. I want to make that clear. Carbon dioxide is not competing with oxygen for hemoglobin. Okay? I also want to point out, going back to this equation right here, when carbon dioxide combines with water, to form carbonic acid, it's an acid because that carbonic acid releases hydrogen ions. What's the significance of this? Well, what this means is the higher the carbon dioxide content of your plasma, the more hydrogen ions will be found in your plasma, and the lower the pH. So as carbon dioxide levels rise in your blood, pH falls. And that's going to be important when we talk about how respiration is regulated. Okay? All right, let's move to internal respiration. So we've moved from the respiratory membrane, where we had the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, and now we've moved to the systemic capillaries. So here's the blood in our systemic capillaries, and here are tissues. All right, here oxygen's being unloaded from the red blood cell, from the hemoglobin of the red blood cell into the plasma, and then diffuses to the tissues. Carbon dioxide is being given off by the tissues. It is moving down its partial pressure gradient into the plasma. It's combining with water to form carbonic acid, and then that's dissociating into bicarbonate ion and hydrogen ions. Okay, right? We have the same players here that we had in external respiration. It's just that the process is moving in the opposite direction. Okay? Unloading of oxygen, loading of carbon dioxide. Now, let's focus on that carbon dioxide, because something interesting is going to happen here. So because carbon dioxide levels are increasing, hydrogen ion levels are increasing, and that is causing the pH to drop. So the pH of blood in the veins is lower than pH of blood in the arteries, certainly. Something else happens when the pH levels drop. Remember that proteins are sensitive to pH, and it's because they have hydrogen bonds. And a change in pH can make those hydrogen bonds, which are weak, break, or make them even weaker. And what that will do is change the shape of, in this case, the hemoglobin molecules, ever so slightly. When that happens, oxygen can't carry as much, when that happens, hemoglobin can't bind as much oxygen as it normally does. And so hemoglobin will give off more oxygen as the pH levels drop, and that's called the Bohr effect. Now, something else I should point out. All of the oxygen does not leave the red blood cells in the capillaries, right? Typically, hemoglobin, when it leaves the capillaries, it's only dumped like 50% of its oxygen. Okay, so deoxygenated blood is about 50% saturated. Blood leaving the pulmonary capillaries is the lungs is like 100% saturated, but that which returns is about 50% saturated. If you have some tissues that are really, like, let's say, like, you're running or something, and you're really using those muscles in your lower appendages, and they're producing lots of carbon dioxide, that's dropping the pH of the blood moving through those muscles, and that's causing those red blood cells to give off even more oxygen where it's needed, right? This is just a mechanism by which tissues of the body that need more oxygen can get them. This is called the Bohr effect. B-O-H-R, not B-O-R-E. that you might describe, the word you might use to describe some of my screencasts. This figure here just sort of illustrates what I was just talking about. The fact that blood that's returning to the heart, the deoxygenated blood, right, is about 50% saturated. It's not zero. So this shows the relative amounts of of carbon dioxide and oxygen in air, outside air in the alveoli, blood in the pulmonary veins, the tissues, and blood leaving the tissues going back to the heart. So you can see that, inspired air, right, is many, many orders of magnitude greater in oxygen as carbon dioxide. Once it gets into our lungs, though, right, right, it drops considerably because we've got, carbon dioxide being unloaded from the alveolar capillaries, right? So you can see the, oxygen levels are about twice that of carbon dioxide. Blood leaving the pulmonary veins, blood leaving the lungs, right, is has about twice the level of oxygen as does carbon dioxide, similar to the air in the lungs. Then it gets to the tissues. Notice there's more carbon dioxide in the tissues than is in oxygen. So oxygen is unloaded to the tissues. Carbon dioxide is loaded to the the capillaries, such that when blood leaves the tissues via the systemic veins, notice that carbon dioxide levels are slightly higher than oxygen levels. When they're coming in, twice the level of oxygen is carbon dioxide. Leaving, carbon dioxide slightly higher than oxygen, right? And notice that we've only unloaded about half of that oxygen. Okay, only about half of that oxygen is unloaded from the tissues, right? It returns. All right, and then it returns, and then carbon dioxide gets unloaded, oxygen gets loaded, and then the blood that leaves is back to being twice the level of oxygen as carbon dioxide. Okay? Okay, so before moving on, I just want to make sure that I addressed all of the questions that you had with respect to describing external gas exchange, identifying the form and location in which oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood, and explaining how carbon dioxide levels affect pH. Are there any questions before we cover the last topic? Before I move on to the last topic, I just want to make sure everyone understands that for those of you who may have got disconnected or for whatever reason couldn't hear parts of this lecture, I do tape this lecture and I do place it on Blackboard. So if you had any connectivity problems or what have you, you will have the ability to watch this video in its entirety or in parts later. Okay, well, if there are no questions, let's cover our last topic. And our last topic is on control of respiration. So this is how the body controls pulmonary ventilation. So we're going to explain how carbon dioxide and pH in the blood are related, which I've sort of touched on already, and lots of questions about that, right? Explain how the nervous system controls respiration, define hypoxia, hypercapnia, and describe carbon monoxide poisoning. I want everyone to do this, right? And I can't see that you're doing this, but I just want you to do this for me. Hold your breath for 10 seconds. I'm going to do it right now, and I'm going to mark it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Actually, I should have made it 20, but that's okay, right? All right, do you have certain urges while you hold your breath? Anyone? This is the participation part. I should have had you hold your breath for 20 seconds instead of 10. I don't think you quite get the urges that I'm thinking about. But all of you have held your breath for like as long as you could, probably, right? What happens while you're holding your breath? Quick, somebody say it or text it. Right. Your body tells you you need to start breathing. You get this urge to breathe, right? If you've ever held, I mean, that's normal. You get this urge to breathe. And let's say you held your breath for as long as you could, right? And you finally let it out. How would you describe your respiration rate? Is it elevated? Is it depressed? Or is it about the same? Right? It's going to be elevated, right? You're going to be breathing hard. If you hold your breath as long as possible, whenever you let it out, you're always going, right? Okay. That urge to breathe and that increase in respiration rate has everything to do with carbon dioxide and pH, because those basically are the main drivers of our respiration rate. Okay. So let's look at that. All right, so breathing is under the control of the nervous system, right? The main muscles that are involved are your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles. They're not the only ones. Your respiratory center is your medulla and pons. They control rate and depth of respiration, and then they send impulses out via the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm and the intercostal nerves to the intercostal muscles. Okay. Overdose of sleeping pills or morphine or too much alcohol can suppress the medulla so much that one literally dies in one's sleep because you're no longer breathing. If you ever wondered how do overdoses of sleeping pills or morphine or alcohol or together work, that's what they do. They suppress the medulla oblongata to such the extent that respiration rate is not sufficient to drive sufficient external respiration. All right. Also, I mentioned in lab, it's why people with neck injuries, you should never move them. You always stabilize the neck, because if you break that phrenic nerve, they will go into respiration. They will go into respiratory arrest, and if they don't get put on a respirator quick, they will die. All right, a couple of terms. Eupnea is normal respiration rate. That is 12 to 15 ventilations per minute. That's normal respiration rate. Hyperpnea is increased respiration rate due to extra oxygen needs, like after you exercise, okay, or if you hold your breath for a long period of time, right, your respiration rate increases, okay. Hyperpnea, with hyperpnea, you can get active expiration. Like typically, expiration is passive, inspiration is active. With hyperpnea, you can, since you're forcing air out of your lungs, expiration can be active as well. All righty, do you have conscious control of breathing? Well, to a certain extent, of course you do, right? When you can hold your breath to try to get rid of hiccups, to just mess around. When you dive in the water, you hold your breath, etc. If you pass some, if somebody let fly a gaseous excretion, you might hold your breath until you get far away from them, what have you, right? So you certainly have a certain amount of control over breathing. However, it's limited. There comes a point where your cerebral cortex that's been sending impulses to your medulla and your pons saying don't breathe, they stop listening, and then they'll take over. So eventually, you can hold your breath for as long as you can. Eventually, the medulla and pons stop listening, and they will make you breathe, right? So if there's a little kid that wants to hold their breath to get what they want, right, or get you to do what they want, just let them hold their breath. Right? I found this little saying online, which I like. My kid threatened to hold her breath until I gave her dessert. She's now passed out on the kitchen floor. I don't negotiate with terrorists. Thought that was pretty funny. Emotional factors can affect breathing, right? You've heard of waiting with bated breath. Perhaps something has scared you half to death and you gasp. Of course, you take breaths between words that you utter. Like I have to take breaths, but at certain points as I'm lecturing here, right? Emotional factors, hyperventilating during anxiety, all those different things can affect breathing, and they're all mediated via the nervous system. All right, most important regulator of breathing is carbon dioxide and pH, right? Your medulla oblongata responds directly to changes in pH of the cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds it. So, cerebral spinal fluid is made from the blood. So if there are changes in the pH of the blood, it affects changes in the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid. Carbon dioxide and water form carbonic acid per this equation here. And we just saw this a few minutes ago. Carbon dioxide and water form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So the more carbon dioxide in the blood, the lower the pH. So when you are holding your breath, carbon dioxide levels are increasing in your blood, pH levels are dropping in your blood. And the reason why you get that urge to breathe is because the medulla oblongata detects the drop in the drop in pH, and it's sending impulses saying, breathe, you fool, breathe. As blood pH decreases, respiration rate increases. That is why after you have held your breath for as long as you can and you start breathing again, your respiration rate is elevated, because your body is trying to get rid of carbon dioxide and bring the pH levels back up to the normal range. Okay, as blood pH increases, respiration rate decreases the other way as well. Okay, that is why after an episode of hyperventilation, the people who hyperventilate typically will either stop breathing for a period of time, or their breathing will, respiration rate will be lower. Again, the medulla oblongata is responding to, in this case, an increase in pH and is trying to bring it back down to the normal, back up back down to the normal range. Okay. This is also why historically they'd have people breathe into a bag when they were hyperventilating, because they're rebreathing the exhaled air, and that's going to help restore the carbon dioxide levels in their blood. Now, does the medulla oblongata respond to a lack of oxygen? It does, but it's not very sensitive to a lack of oxygen. So in other words, your body is designed to respond to changes in carbon dioxide and pH, not so much a lack of oxygen. Typically, when your medulla oblongata responds to a lack of oxygen, you're very close to passing out. There are these sensors in the aorta and the carotid artery that can detect oxygen levels, but again, they're not very sensitive. Okay? And that is why, if you've ever ridden a plane and they're going through the safety features, they always tell you that if we lose cabin pressure, the masks will fall and you should grab them and put them on. They don't say, when you feel you need air, grab a mask and put it on. And it's because if you lose cabin pressure, pressure of oxygen as well as carbon dioxide drops. You will not feel the need to breathe. You will not feel the urge to breathe like you do when you hold your breath. In fact, you may even, due to the drop in oxygen levels, you may actually begin to feel like a little drunk and want to play with the oxygen masks. So that's why they say if the oxygen masks fall, you put them on. And specifically, they tell you put them on yourself first before you assist the child, because if you don't act quickly, you can literally pass out, and then the child's not able to put their masks on or put them on you. Before I end, I do want to contrast two terms, and that's hyperpnea and hyperventilation. All right, so I said hyperpnea is an increase in breathing rate, but that is an increase in breathing rate that accompanies an increase in oxygen demand, such as when you exercise. When you exercise, your muscles need more energy, so they need more oxygen, so you breathe heavier. With hyperventilation, there's an increase in respiration rate, but in the absence of an increase in oxygen demand. Okay, when you when one hyperventilates, it's an increase in respiration rate that's not coupled with an increase in the need of oxygen. So I just want to make sure that those two terms, that you can distinguish those two terms. Hypoxia is inadequate oxygen delivery to body tissues. It can be due to blockage of an artery. It could be due to anemia. Someone could have respiratory disease. Any of those reasons that decrease delivery of oxygen to tissues can produce hypoxia. One form of hypoxia that I'm going to end on is carbon monoxide poisoning. And I want to stress this is monoxide, not carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is the leading cause of death from a fire. Usually when people die from a fire, it's not because they got severe burns, but it's because of smoke inhalation associated with carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is created for incomplete combustion. Usually oxygen is not unlimited when there's a fire. And so you have some fuel that is burned incompletely, and you get carbon monoxide released. Carbon monoxide outcompetes oxygen for hemoglobin. Okay, something like, I want to say it's like hundreds of times, actually I think thousands of times, a better binder to hemoglobin than oxygen. And our bodies have no ability to detect carbon monoxide. It is odorless, it is colorless, and it does not change the pH of our blood. So our bodies cannot detect carbon monoxide. So if you are asleep at night in your house, and for some reason there is the production of carbon monoxide by, say, your hot water heater, you can literally die in your sleep of hypoxia because the oxygen is being displaced by the carbon monoxide and you have no mechanism to detect the carbon monoxide. And so you die in your sleep. That's why it's so important in your homes, to your apartments, wherever you live, every floor should have a carbon monoxide detector. If you have any kind of gas that's being used, if you're all electric, then it's not necessary. But if you have a gas heater or gas fireplace, anything with gas, you should have a carbon monoxide detector on every level. If you got 3 levels, you can have one on every level. I have 3 levels in my house. I have one on every level. You can save your life and those of your family and friends for as little as $30. And make sure you test them once a month as well. All right, just a couple of things that can affect ventilation I want to mention, and then we'll end. Of course, paralysis, damage to muscles, damage to the nervous system. Obesity can decrease the ability of your thoracic cavity to stretch, arthritis. And of course, in infants that are premature, the lungs are often not completely developed. And of course, excuse me. And of course, what am I looking for? Of course, damage to the respiratory system and anything that interferes with gas exchange or pulmonary ventilation will affect ventilation. Okay, so I went over my time, but only by 10 minutes this time. So from here on out, I'll just open up the